Come on, little thing. It's not going live. What's going on here?
Or maybe it is live, and maybe we're just doing these conversations.
Let me check here.
It actually is live.
It looks like it's live. All right, we're live. UI is acting weird, not letting me know. Okay. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to another episode of AngularAir. I am your host, Justin. And on today's episode, we are going to be talking GraphQL, the product Hasura. Should be pretty cool. Looking forward to it. New version of that. We had a previous episode where we talked about that. So there's a new version. So let's get into it. We'll say hi to our panelists, then we'll meet our guest, and then we'll get into the content. Joining us today, we've got Alyssa with us. Alyssa, how's it going?
Wonderful to be here. Hello, everyone.
Nice. And Bonnie's with us. Bonnie, how's it going?
It's great. I'm very excited. This is going to be a great episode.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And our guest joining us once again is Tanmai. Tanmai, how's it going?
Hey. All good. Chugging along,
Nice. So glad to have you back. You were here recently. I don't know how long ago. Was it a couple months ago or?
It was a while. I had to bug him to get him to come back because he's working. He's like so busy working on Hasura, and I'm like, Tanmai, come and see us. And he's like, I will. Okay, hold on.
I think it was
because he did promise us last time
working.
I know, like he's got other stuff to do besides hang out with us. Rude. But he is, but it's worth it though, because I'm just kidding. But he's doing such important work.
I think it was early this year. Was it early this year or was it late last year?
I think it was late last year.
Like a handful of months ago, right? It wasn't too long. It wasn't like a year ago, was it?
No.
Yeah. All right.
But I've been excited the whole time, so it seems like it's been forever.
Seems like you've been waiting for that. Awesome. Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you back for sure. What's the latest? What's going on?
Good. Lots of GraphQL stuff as usual. I think this has been something that we've been working on for almost the last year. And we finally were able to kind of ship it out just about a month ago. It was a massively complex release for us. There was a lot of stuff that we had planned to do that was on the roadmap, and there was just like a massive engineering effort to pull off. So it's been a busy few months, but now the release is out, so there's a lot of stuff happening there. And generally otherwise as well, keeping up with the GraphQL ecosystem, right? Things are there's a lot more kind of GraphQL penetration happening everywhere. People are figuring out all kinds of use cases with it, right? So it's been tremendous.
Nice. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to talk about too while we're in here is I haven't really looked lately on what the latest is with GraphQL. So maybe while we're going over stuff, we can kind of get a kind of a review of what might be the latest and greatest with that as well.
Absolutely. I think so. GraphQL is like the API specification, right? And the GraphQL specification is kind of governed by the foundation. So when we think about kind of like the latest and greatest in the GraphQL world, it's really kind of broken up into these two categories, right? One is what's up with the GraphQL specification, how is that evolving? And the second is generally in the ecosystem, right? What are people doing with GraphQL? What kind of tooling are people building around GraphQL? So I think on the specification side itself, which is governed by the GraphQL Foundation, we're one of the founding members of the foundation with a handful of other companies. That kind of governs the spec. The good thing about the GraphQL spec is that not much happens, which is really good because it's a solid specification. It's a slow-moving specification. Features get added like slowly to the specification itself, right? Which is a nice thing, I think, because it's like, imagine if the REST specification kept changing every year, right? You're like, what? How do we even build anything? So I think that's been good, but two new things coming out on the specification that have been in the works for a while, I think, are that I'm particularly excited about is two GraphQL directives called stream and defer, which is basically a way of indicating in your GraphQL API call through what is called a GraphQL directive, but think of it as like a normal API call that you make with an additional maybe header or something, or a parameter that that specifies something. That's kind of what a GraphQL directive is. And those two directives are stream and defer. And that kind of basically what it lets you do is the defer directive lets you say that here's this kind of query that I'm making, right, which is the different pieces of data that I want. And this piece of the query, I'm okay with that coming back to me a little bit later. So give me the rest of this query as quickly as you can, and then give me this bit whenever you have it, right? It's not critical for me to load the kind of page, right? So if you're thinking about it as like you're loading maybe a blog page with comments. Right? You want to get the blog content out ASAP, then maybe the comments, a little bit later. That's fine. So that kind of makes that process really convenient. And the other one, which is stream, which is this basically a directive to tell the server that to tell your GraphQL server that I want to fetch this list of things, but don't wait till you have the full list. Just send it to me piece by piece, right? And so the server can basically send you, if it's like a list of 100 things, the server can just send it piece by piece, which is also really nice because then you can kind of gradual render and stuff like that, right? So that's kind of two new things in the spec. We haven't added those two to Hasura yet. It's not officially a part of the spec yet. I think officially it'll make its way into the spec around May. And that's kind of around then we'll add support for stream and defer to Hasura too.
Nice. Yeah, and that's like a great concept. You're talking about like the spec and the things like that, and then my mind immediately goes to, well, how do I deal with the defer? How do I do the spec? And that's then the tooling that you refer to around making that happen, right?
Exactly.
So we have the stream and the defer, and I'm going to see if I can find. There's not a link to it yet because it's not part of the official. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not a part of the official spec yet, but there's a lot of nice discussions happening. So if you just like Google for GraphQL spec, defer, GraphQL spec stream, you'll see. But there we go. There's an RFC here. Let me just pop that in the chat here, and then
they're also asking for you to speak slower because you're telling us about really cool new stuff that we've never heard of yet. But you talk really fast sometimes. I do too when I get excited.
I talk fast all the time. It's like people are like, wait, are you on something? I'm like, no. This is just me. This is just normal life.
So Fergus, you might have to put the video on like 0.75 speed. You can do that, I think, on YouTube.
Yeah, you can do it on the ones you're watching. I wonder if there's a way to like slow the stream down. So because we're live right now, like could people actually like dial down the speed on the same way you dial down? I don't know.
I shall do that. I shall just turn like a knob here, go a little slower. There we go.
I did the same thing. Anything that I'm excited about talking about, like it just starts coming out all super fast because you get just so into it for sure. For sure. So yeah, when I think about like the spec and just like you were saying, like with REST spec and things like that, I expect like the GraphQL, maybe it doesn't change so much over time. It kind of gets established and you're excited with it, right?
Yep.
And one of the things I want to ask about is kind of off the side, but I don't want to forget is like I talk to a lot of people and you have people that are really embedded in REST, and we talked about this on the last episode, right? Of like the benefit of GraphQL, and I don't know, like I feel like I have a pretty good case for describing why GraphQL is so awesome in like kind of an elevator pitch, but it doesn't seem to like stick. Do you have a way to like kind of something that sticks really well? That's a short elevator pitch of like why we really should be considering GraphQL, you know?
Yeah, that's a hard one, right? So whenever we think about kind of this GraphQL and REST thing, right? I think one of the most important things is to just break that down into why you're thinking about it, right? Because if we get into this kind of cargo culting kind of mentality of saying, oh, everybody's talking about GraphQL, let's do GraphQL. There's this dude speaking really quickly on a live stream about GraphQL, right? Let's do it. So that's not the reason. That's dangerous, right? Because you want to think very carefully about the why of GraphQL, right? And why you're bringing it in, and then use that to think about the pros and cons, right? When I think about kind of talking about the benefit of GraphQL, right? The way I think about it is and this is like very meta, right? Not at a developer level, because for developers it's pretty clear. You try GraphQL out, all you have to do is try it. You try it out once and then you're hooked, and then you're like, yep, this makes sense. Or you try it out and you're like, no, 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 I don't want it, right? But but a level above that, right? If you think about kind of the meta philosophy of GraphQL, it's just basically saying, do you want developers in your team and the people in your team to be to have self-service kind of ability to do things, right? And that's like a rhetorical question, because nobody's going to say no, right?
No,
so you want to be like you, right? So you ask that, because that's what people want, right? They want to be, I mean, the reason why we have tools like Angular, right, that, and even the genesis of Angular, is because we wanted to make front-end developers self-service. We wanted them to be able to say, what if I don't have to depend on the server to render complex pieces of my application? I don't want to go modify the API rendering HTML template thingamajig on the back end. I just want to own it, and I want to build the best experience that I can, because I can contain that, right? If you think about serverless functions, you think about database as a service, you think about any innovation that's happening today in the cloud, in the JavaScript, in any ecosystem, it's driven by the fact of saying, you want to make people productive as individuals or as small teams where they are, right? And when we think about GraphQL in that respect, it's basically saying, do you want your developers to wait to get the perfect API that they need, or do you want them to just figure it out themselves, right? And obviously you want them to just get what they need, and that's kind of where GraphQL really comes in, right? And says that, you don't have to wait for humans or process or anything to get that perfect API, that perfect slice of data. You can just let developers get it themselves, right? So kind of making the case for GraphQL is easy, but the challenge with that is that, I mean, but then, and that's kind of when the conversation starts, right? Which is like, but how do I build GraphQL? How do I do GraphQL? What about like my existing tooling with REST? How do I transition? How do I? So there's a lot of stuff there. But I think the pitch and the pull for GraphQL and having GraphQL is very aligned with what people want to do, right? It's not different to things that are happening in the world today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is so good. So thank you so much. Like the self-service, like you said, it's such a great thing. Like, you want to empower them. And then when people hear that, psychologically, you're not going to say, oh, I don't want that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe when you try it, you might decide that it might be a different fit. But it's hard to say, like, I don't want that, right? Oh, yeah, I totally want my developers to be able to be more effective and productive and not have to wait, right? Yeah. Oh, that's such a great way to put it. I love it. Thank you. Now I feel empowered to provide that information and get people at least thinking about it, not shutting the door and saying, no, we're all REST, right?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's kind of one of the things that is with the 2.0 release, right? One of the things that we were working on was exactly this problem, which was basically saying that when we kind of look at GraphQL and people like GraphQL, right? They're like, I really love GraphQL. My team likes it. My engineers like it, right? They love using the API, which is a GraphQL API. But if we had to put this in production, there is just so much that we have to think about, right? For example, REST is not going to go away. You're still going to have a bunch of REST clients and REST consumers. And so do we maintain both APIs at the same time? Do we maintain a GraphQL API and a REST API, right? That's a very legitimate concern. Or you have things like, for example, I have so much tooling around my REST API, especially in enterprise environments, or especially in like established engineering teams. You might have an API gateway, you might have a CDN, you have PagerDuty hooked up to REST errors, right? So every time there's a REST error that crosses a certain threshold, there's a APM integration, and then maybe a PagerDuty integration that pings you and tells you if things are going wrong, right? You have so much of that tooling, you have so much education that's already happened, and you're going to have existing API consumers in that environment, right? Even if people like GraphQL, it's really hard to start transitioning to GraphQL, because then you're like, is that ROI going to be worth it, right? And this isn't a clear answer, right? This is a hard problem, and in a lot of cases, the ROI might not be worth it, right? And I say this as a GraphQL Foundation founding member and as a a person who's built their company around GraphQL, right? But it is nuanced, right? And so one of the things that we did with 2.0 is we said, what if you can get the benefits of GraphQL, right? Where you get the self-service experience, right? You get exactly the data that you want. You get the documentation experience. You get all of that. But in production, you're also just able to use REST, right? And so we did this thing where you create this GraphQL query, you click on a button, and you get a REST endpoint, right? For that GraphQL query. So you're kind of getting the benefits of both, right? You're getting that benefit of GraphQL. You also have a GraphQL API, but then you can also just use that to craft perfect REST endpoints that you can use. And this is especially useful for most of the people on the planet who don't get the opportunity to build something absolutely
hold
new
on,
from scratch.
Hold on, wait. You're going so fast. You just said something really cool. You just click on a thing and you get a REST endpoint.
Exactly,
what
from
thing?
A GraphQL endpoint.
What do you mean? Whoa! You just do a thing and you get a REST endpoint. Is it like what thing did you have to do?
It's
you can't
really
skip that.
complicated.
That's like draw the rest of the owl.
Yeah, no, it's a really complicated thing where like a lot of neurons come together. There's nerve signals, there's muscles being triggered. It goes to your finger. Your finger has to go find the mouse. There's a little button. You click on that button. It's a complex process. You have to click on this button to get a REST endpoint. Yeah, it's takes a lot of time. It's medicine and science still hasn't figured out how this works, but it.
So this addresses that concern that you're talking about of like the investment to get there, right? That somebody says, look, this is because when we talk about consuming GraphQL, there's infrastructure that we have to put into our application to do that, different from if we already are consuming REST stuff, right? And so what you're talking about is the fact that like we could get the GraphQL layer in there, have that power, but then not have to worry about adopting that infrastructure in our app just yet. We could provide a REST experience for now and then slowly get there. That's awesome.
Exactly. Yep. I can do a quick screen share and show you what that looks like.
Yeah, and I don't think we summarize what Hasura is and what it's doing. We've kind of talked about it, but maybe we can also do that too.
Let's do it. So
awesome.
So I think it's a quick introduction to Hasura. We are our aim is to basically simplify data access to make kind of data access self-serve and say there's so much data lying around. It's so painful to get access to that data. It's in different places. It shouldn't be this painful. Why should somebody have to manually build an API that has to do this? What does it take to automate this? And so when we launched the open source project in late 2018, we use GraphQL as the API that makes this ability to query stuff possible. And so the way it works is you take Hasura, it's a Docker container, you point it to your data sources, do a little bit of configuration, and you get your API and you're good to go. That API is production ready, both for internal use cases or external use cases that are facing like external apps or end users. And it takes it reduces quarters to just weeks. Instead of having to build that data access API, you're able to just do that within days and weeks. And over the last 2 years, I think we've seen just a phenomenal amount of traction and adoption in enterprise, especially, which has been great to see. One, because it kind of means that the product is enterprise grade and mission critical grade. I think one of our use cases is like, if there's a minute of downtime, it costs them $1 million. This is the thing that gives me a heart attack, because it's like, oops, 30 seconds of downtime, that's 500K gone. And so it's been really, really kind of exciting to see that. And with our recent work with 2.0, there's a lot of stuff that we wanted to do around simultaneously connecting to multiple databases, the GraphQL recipes that we just talked about. That's also kind of made its way and landed. So that's the quick introduction to Hasura.
Nice.
All right, let me see if I can just quickly share my screen and we can kick things off. All right, just a second. There we go.
And so we're getting into 2.0 version of this, whereas we had an episode previous, so you can look up on our AngularAir list of videos where we talked about 1.0. So now we're into 2.0, right?
Yep. So can you folks see my screen?
Yes.
Cool.
Yep.
Awesome. So that's the Hasura kind of control plane or the configuration UI. Basically, what's happening here is that I have a Docker container that I have fired up that's running, and that basically gives me an endpoint, like an HTTP endpoint. That's my API server. That's the GraphQL endpoint. And in this particular case for this demo, I'm running it on our cloud service, which is Hasura Cloud. But it's exactly the same if you were running the open source version on your laptop in your own cloud, wherever you were running it. And so that's my GraphQL endpoint. What I can go in and do is add a data source. So I can just go in and kind of say connect a database. So I have a music database lying around with which is a SQL Server database, and that's a new 2.0 thing. We used to just do Postgres and the Postgres family. Earlier with this release with 2.0, we added support for SQL Server as well, and BigQuery, and MySQL, which is coming out soon. So that's kind of one of the big things that we did, which was this internal generalization that was quite complex and fun to do. But that's my. Go ahead.
Really quick on that, just to kind of give a summary of it, that's one of the powers of GraphQL, right? Is this ability to say you can use that as this bridge to map data from different sources and feed it through the one pipeline, right?
Exactly, right. And that's the nice thing about GraphQL, which is a specification, right? It's like an API specification. You can do whatever you want with it, right? You can connect it to multiple data sources. It can map to databases like it does with Hasura. It can also just not have any data source, and it can just like you get this GraphQL API, and it's just making up data on the fly and sending it along, right? So that's the really nice thing about it being the specification. But specifically, the graph in GraphQL is a very useful model when you start thinking about I have multiple things in different places. They're all connected together, right? And so they have kind of a semantic graph. They're pieced together, and that's where GraphQL becomes really, really nice, right? To be able to do that. So it's a good fit there.
And I think for our Angular viewers that are, if you're thinking about the things we do in Angular and how does that correlate conceptually, right? That how we can do it. I think of things like state management, and like let's say we have like NGRX and we would do selectors, right? And the selectors map down from different sources what we specifically want, right? Or if we're in an observable stream, right? We might use an observable stream and do operators to take data coming in from different sources and map it into what we want. It's the same. For me, mentally, the same concept going on here, that GraphQL provides us that layer of mapping these sources and feeding out a set structure or whatever we need to do, right?
Exactly. And then ultimately, from kind of an integration standpoint, it's just an HTTP API. And we'll take a look at that for folks who are a little bit new to GraphQL. And ultimately, it's just an API call that is making a query. So when you kind of think about that integration, it's just the piece where the API call is being made in the code that switches over to this slightly different way of doing things. And if you're using a GraphQL client, you typically don't even have to bother with that, actually making the API call and the mechanics of that. It gets abstracted out if you're using GraphQL client as well. So here, what I've done is basically add kind of a database. And as soon as I do that, what Hasura kind of goes in, peeks inside the database and says, hey, these are the models that I have that exist in the database. Do you want to kind of bring them up and expose them as an API, right? And so I'm like, yes, I do. I want to expose albums, and then maybe let's go and add in an artist is a music database, and then let's go in and bring in a tracks, right? This is always my standard data set for doing demos. And then these models have kind of relationships between them, right? Because each album has an artist has a bunch of albums and whatnot. So I'm just going to kind of bootstrap that as well, right? And so now what I get is what Hasura has basically done here, right? In this complex thing called clicking, is what it's done is it's basically gone to the database, looked at the type, it's just gone to artist, and it's seen, hey, here's the artist table. It has an ID and a name. ID is integer, name is kind of string, right? It's looked at all that information. It's mapped that and created the API server. So instead of you kind of writing code, creating that model, right, and then mapping that to what you have in your database, and setting that up, you don't have to do that, right? So instead of like a few hours of writing that code, making it production ready, all of those things you don't have to worry about. Hasura kind of just does that on the fly. One of the very interesting things from an engineering point of view about building Hasura has been that it's basically kind of a API server on the fly, right? There is no build step. Usually when you're building an API, there's a build step, right? You build you write code, you build an API, you deploy it. With Hasura, it's like a service it's just running. You keep making API calls to the Hasura service so that it can keep reconfiguring itself on the fly. So whenever I'm clicking on the UI, I'm actually just making API calls to Hasura and I'm saying, hey, Hasura, there's a album table. Do you want to track that? Yes. There's a relationship. Remove this relationship. Add this database. Remove this database. So Hasura is basically kind of doing the whole thing on the fly without a build step. And so it's kind of like from an engineering point of view, a compiler running as a service. So it's kind of like a just-in-time compiler running as a web service. And that's kind of how it works internally. And what that essentially lets me do is say things like, oh, here's artist ID name, go run that query. And then, fetch albums. Each artist has a bunch of albums, so go fetch that. And that's kind of the GraphQL query, right? So for those of you who are new to GraphQL, essentially what's happening is underneath it, it's just a request, a post request to this endpoint, right? And what you're doing is you're sending this query as a payload, right? And this is kind of similar to maybe like a get endpoint where you have, artists, something like an artist endpoint, artists with albums. Maybe that would have been a REST endpoint that was serving this, right? So it's kind of analogous to that. The difference is that I get to specify what I want, right? So if I don't want ID, for example, I remove that from here, and I get this, right? So I can kind of choose what slice of data I want, right? So that's kind of what GraphQL looks like. The bit that I was talking about, which is that you can now convert this into a perfect REST endpoint, right? It's something like, say, for example, I want to fetch the first 10. And I want to create now an endpoint where I want a REST endpoint where I can fetch artists with this kind of with this kind of limit or this pagination kind of thing parameterized. So what I can do is I can parameterize it at the Hasura level and say get artists and say dollar limit is an integer. Let's just make sure that this works. And so we have. So this is just kind of the way of passing parameters in a GraphQL query. So if I limit that to 1, I'm just going to get like 1 result, right? What I can do here is click on this button. And now this becomes a REST endpoint. And so I can say /artists, right? And I want to make this a get endpoint. So now essentially this becomes like a artist albums, right? And so that becomes my REST endpoint where I can with albums, right? And now I can start. And now I can basically start kind of making that query. I'm sorry, I'll have to refresh the page. Just remove this here and see if I can run that query again. Yeah. So now I have this REST endpoint, right? And I can make this, if I just curl that or I hit that endpoint, I'm going to get the exact same result that I was getting with GraphQL. But the good thing with this GraphQL query, so the good thing about this REST endpoint now is that it's an idiomatic REST endpoint. It's a get API endpoint. It has all of the HTTP error codes. You can do whatever kind of caching you want on it, right? All of those things. And this makes it easy, especially if you want to kind of use GraphQL maybe as an internal API for your developers to kind of browse and decide what they want to do. But in production, or maybe for an external API, you'd rather expose it as a REST endpoint, right? So it makes that really kind of convenient. And then, of course, you don't have to maintain 2 different API services, right? It's the same Hasura configuration that's powering both your GraphQL API and your REST API. So that's kind of what that looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So this instance of Hasura is a Docker container.
Yes, it's a
Docker. Yeah. So if I'm because I'm thinking about like if I'm a business and I want to start doing this, right? Like, and we talked about the challenges around how do I get GraphQL into my ecosystem, and that's what this is solving, right? So just kind of summarize it. I would create this Docker image from this, I would deploy it, Now I could hit this, open up my network to get to this running, service, right? I'd be able to now hit this and do all my configuration within this web application that's configuring that underlying server, and boom, I'm off and running, right? And in terms of getting this into my environment.
Exactly.
Awesome.
That's exactly what it looks like. And then of course, you might want to version control this configuration, right? The tables that I've tracked, the relationships that I have.
Yes, I do. How do I do that?
Yep. So everything, the Hasura configuration itself is basically a JSON configuration, right? So I can, at any point of time, kind of export that. Let me see if I can just pop that into my Chrome here. That's not what I want to open. Oh, there you go. I don't know if you can see my screen. Can you folks see my screen?
Yeah, I saw it a second ago.
Oops, just a second.
The JSON file?
Yep. Let me see if I had some metadata JSON. There you go. Right. So that's the underlying configuration file. Right. That's the configuration file that says, hey, you have a table called albums. It has a relationship to the artist table, right? So that's kind of what the UI is doing. The UI is just a skin on top of this configuration that is helping you kind of just configure these things on the fly. And at any point of time, you can always, just take that JSON, put it into version control. In our local development workflow, we have this mode where as you're using the UI, it's automatically kind of just writing this JSON configuration to a folder on your file system. So that way you don't even have to export, import manually. As you use the UI, this JSON config file just gets updated on your file system. You just, whenever you're satisfied, you're done. You just do a git commit, save that, check that into version control, and then maybe you have some kind of CI/CD action that basically goes and just applies this to your production Hasura instance. So that entire thing just becomes automated. And there's a bunch of really nice community kind of GitHub actions and stuff like that you can just throw onto your repo. And then as you make changes locally, you try out your GraphQL API locally, you're satisfied, push that to GitHub, gets deployed to your production Hasura instance, and you're off to the races.
So awesome, man. So awesome. So how do I secure this new REST endpoint? Like, how much control do I really have over creating this new REST endpoint in terms of security and things like that? So could I actually get to a point where I'm saying, hey, I'm making REST endpoints right now in Java or C#? Like, can I just use this? Is it going to allow me to do everything I need to do, or are there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the underlying kind of, the way Hasura kind of works is and the way the Hasura automation works, right, is basically saying that if you think about kind of this overall, if you think about things from kind of an API design point of view, right, like what API design you want to have, and you're going to work backwards from that to build your API. The way Hasura kind of encourages you to think is, say, let's separate out our application, our API, into reads and writes, right? And so first, let's do the read models. So what you do is, whatever data source you have, you set up the models optimized for kind of the reads that you want to have, right? And then as soon as you set up your read models, you then expose the API over those read models, right? And you secure them. And I'll go into kind of how to secure those API, because right now I can query for everything, right? This is not a great API that you want to expose unless you want Cambridge Analytica to kind of come in and take your data. But if you're kind of exposing that data, you want to secure it, right? So you do the read side of it first. Now, this takes care of 50 to 80% of your application, because that's typically the amount of volume of like reads that you have, right? Then you kind of get to the write side, which is like the APIs that do transactions or mutations and stuff like that. And there Hasura has a kind of bunch of different models to help you write those APIs, right? So for example, you can have a reactive model for writing, which is basically you do a GraphQL mutation, it submits an event, that event goes and triggers a serverless function or some other REST microservice or whatever you have, which is doing some business logic, and then you subscribe to the result. Or you do a synchronous thing where you just ask Hasura to say, hey, I have this existing REST endpoint in my backend service that's been built. Just delegate this particular query or mutation to that service. Don't do anything. Don't try to fetch it yourself or figure it out. Just delegate that. And then Hasura kind of just delegates that to whatever REST endpoint you have. So that's kind of the way the writes work. So you break that up into reads and writes, and then that's kind of how your API comes together. So I'll just give you an example of just trying that out in action, right? So for example, if I have this, we're just doing reads right now, right? And then we'll do an example of a write. So on the read side, for example, when I when I query artists, right now I can just fetch everything, which is not great from an API security point of view. Let me remove this here. Right, you're fetching everything. Now that's not the API that you want to give to and embed in your front-end applications, right? Because you're just like, nope. So what you can kind of go in and do on Hasura is configure that access kind of policy, right? So you can go in and say, I want like a user that's logged in to be able to access this data only if the ID matches, something like that token ID, right? Something coming in from a cookie or a JSON web token, and you decide what fields of this model they ought to have access to, right? And so I want them to have access to ID and name, right? So as soon as I save this policy, right, and then I kind of try it out here, what you'll see is X Hasura role user. So these policies, we call them roles, but they're essentially like scopes, right? So you say X Hasura user ID and 1. So now when I make this query, the first thing that I wanted to like kind of notice is that there's no albums here anymore. The albums kind of field is gone, right? In fact, if I try querying for albums and even just add that to my GraphQL query, right? Whatever, let's say ID, right? I'm going to get a error here that says this doesn't exist. This doesn't exist in your API, right? Why are you trying to query albums, right? Even if I run this query, it says field albums not found. Although we know it's there for the user scope, right? Because we haven't released access on that model, Hasura kind of removes it from the graph. So any reference that albums might have had in our graph gets removed automatically, right? So I can't query for albums. Now, when I query for just the artist, right, I'm just able to kind of query for my own data, right? If I'm user 10, I'm just getting kind of my profile, right? I'm not getting anything else that I don't have access to, right? And so this is on GraphQL. Now, if I created a REST endpoint out of this, it would be exactly the same, right? I would just convert this to a REST endpoint called /getArtist, right? Whatever, let me just quickly type that out here, get artist. And that becomes my REST endpoint, which gives me exactly this data. It behaves in the exact same way. Your JSON web token kind of comes in. Hasura extracts the values from that token. So it says, oh, I know this is user and I know this is user ID 10, and then processes it, makes this kind of underlying query, makes sure that it's scoped in to get access only to that particular piece of information, right? So whether it's REST or GraphQL, on the surface doesn't matter. Ultimately, the same data access kind of policy is really what is enforcing that security. So that's kind of how that works.
And then if I didn't send in the role or the user ID, is that REST endpoint already configured to do the right HTTP responses, REST responses for me?
Exactly. It'll return an error. It'll return like a 403, right? Saying that, nope, this is not even accessible. Why are you trying to hit this API endpoint? Who are you even? Right? Like you don't have
So I really want to help sell, because that REST button, like you said, it's just a little click, right? But I really want to help sell it even more. What I get excited about is like what you just showed right there when you talk about the album, right? If we just step back and think about, if I build a REST endpoint on my own and I have my REST endpoint and I need to empower my developers to be self-serving, right? I need to provide them the documentation of what the request and response model looks like. What do I got to do for that? I got to do a lot of stuff, right? And maybe I use something like Swagger or something like that, and it helps get me there, right? So certainly there's tools, but I have to set up that infrastructure as well, right? One of the benefits we've got here is like, in the course of this episode and a few minutes in this episode, you set up this database, you pointed to it, you got the models back, and all the underlying GraphQL and everything defined the shape that we have available to us. Exactly. So now as a developer, you saw right here, you type this in and it tells us right away like what the model looks like and if there's an actual property on it. We get all that discovery and nobody really had to do any work to provide that, which is super powerful.
Exactly, and that's kind of the big that self-service pull of GraphQL, right? Which is to say, it's all auto-documented, right? Like I can go look at the documentation for this model, and I can be like, "What is artist ID? Oh, it's an integer. That's great. What is name? That's a string. That's fun, right?" So you can see that. You can see the different the different ways of parameterizing it, right? Like I want artist ID where name equal to something, right? What arguments do I have available? What operators are there? What parameters are there? What should be the type of a parameter, right? Is it capital TRUE sent as a string? Is it a Boolean value TRUE, like something that can be encoded in JSON? All of that is just taken care of, right? And if you make mistakes, right, like you say whatever NAEM, right, you get a little red underline, and that tells you, hey, you know what, that doesn't exist, right? Did you mean name? This is convenient. You're not going to make while you're trying out the API, while you're exploring the API, you're just automatically kind of building that understanding of the API model that you actually have, right? Which is great, which just gets rid of so many people and tools in the middle, right? Which was unnecessary. And people just look at it and be like, yep, I understand what my application is doing. I understand what models I have. Now I know how I can fetch it and make stuff happen for the user.
So cool. So cool. I love it.
So yeah, that's kind of how this works internally. One of the other kind of cool things that we did as a part of this release was we also worked on kind of more complex authorization rules that allow for things like policy inheritance. So for example, what you can do is and this is kind of a pretty common use case, right, where right now as a logged in user, I get access to, let's say, my ID and the name, right? Or maybe there was an email field, right, and I get access to email. But if I'm not a logged in user, let's say I'm a public user, right, I'm an anonymous user, I just want username, right? I don't want emails to be visible. And so if you kind of combine those two policies, what you're essentially saying is that any user should fetch their own logged in information, right, and should be able to fetch other people's public information, right? So what you can kind of start doing is composing these policies, right? So I can go into artist and be like, let's add a permission rule called public, right? And say that there's no checks, but you don't get access to ID, you just get access to name. So you don't get ID, you just get name, and that's what you get to be able to query, right? And as soon as you set this rule up, what you can now do is create an inherited role that combines both of these roles together. Like you can do that kind of policy inheritance. So you can go in and say, hey, I want to create a new role called like dashboard, right? And that's going to be a combination of like, public and user, right? And as soon as I use the dashboard role now, that policy composition happens automatically. That means Hasura creates the right graph, the right resources that can be accessed by a combination of these two. It ensures that because of this role having access to certain fields, you can see that. So if you now make a query, you'll get the name for everybody else, and you'll get the username and the email for yourself, right? And those other fields would automatically be nulled out. So that makes it really convenient for, you start thinking about complex scenarios where you want to start giving more and more people access to your APIs. You don't have to do the work of writing code for every single API endpoint and figuring out how to secure it, right? Like imagine you had 100 API endpoints, and now for each of those endpoints, you had to go inside them and you would have to maintain those security rules, right? And then along comes a new kind of security rule. You have to go instrument each of those 100, right? And so now all of that work is just kind of getting removed, and you're really just dealing with, your just thinking about it, right? You're like, let me think. I have models. That's cool. These are security policies at a model level. That's cool. That's easy to understand. I can combine these rules together. That's easy to understand, right? So you're just dealing with kind of the reality of what your domain is, and you're mucking about with the with the infrastructure of setting it up and figuring out performance and scaling this and whatnot, right? So that's kind of that's kind of the direction that we've been going in.
And then everything that you just did gets saved as that JSON file, right? So like I've got configuration. Yep. So like you're done. Now I've got a way to preserve that, ensure that I can spin that up in different environments. Boom, 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 right?
Exactly. Yeah, even review that JSON, right? Like somebody makes a PR, you can go review the diff of that JSON and be like, oh, cool. This looks like this rule was added. This looks like a fine rule to add. I'm good with this, right? So it makes all of that easy.
And all that, there's like so many more finite parts that it affects. Like when you talk about the fact that like, if we're building, rules and things like that, we're building models that represent, right? Or maybe we're building classes or interfaces in our code when we're handwriting this stuff, right? That is gone. We don't have to do that. So like keeping track of those models, sharing them across different spots, like so much stuff is abstracted away that we don't have to worry about.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Right. And then, we kind of want to increase our tooling here, where you can kind of go look at like a summary of all the models and all the access controls and the roles and who has access to what, right? So I can kind of go in and be like, oh, what does public have? And so you can see public doesn't have albums, doesn't have tracks, and this is kind of what that permission looks like for rows and columns. And then you can see that for all of the different roles that you have, right? And especially as your system starts getting complicated, you have like 100 models, 200 models, 500 models. Being able to visualize that or create your own tooling to visualize it, right? Like maybe you want to have like a security stakeholder that needs to review these rules or whatever. Everything that I'm doing is an API. So you can even fetch this permissions information over an API. You can make an API call to say, tell me the permissions for this model, for this role, right? And you can get that information. And so you can create your own security dashboard, and you can see your own security dashboard of who has access to what, and you can correlate with that with actual data access. So you can say that, oh, this rule was used 10 times with these API calls, right? And that's just a phenomenal amount of visibility and being able to secure data without having to do like the manual yuck work of setting all this up, right? And that's immense, right? Especially with like the amount of data that we have around nowadays, and the lack of visibility and observability into what these security rules are, right? It starts becoming more and more important, right?
So I have so much stuff to sell clients on of why to do this. I want you to help drive it home for me. I've got one more thing that I need you to help define and sell, right? If I have, because like the REST part, this new addition with the REST thing and everything, man, it's a big time game changer, right? The other thing is like when I have so I have two endpoints, right? Two different spots of data. It's sourced from one and from the other. And I have a requirement now where I need to bring those together and do a little bit of logic before I deliver it to my client or to my, front end pieces. Am I able to kind of orchestrate, write that type of logic and put that inside of here? Or do I still need to go to code to do that?
Yeah, no. So that is kind of one of the things where it depends on kind of the transformation that you have, right? So let's say, for example, it's just transformation around like it's declarative transformations, meaning that it's the way that you want to change the field names, right? So you don't want name, you want full name, right? Those kinds of transformations. So declarative transformations, Hasura can handle for you. But we took a call a while back to say that if it's genuine like business logic that you need to do, right? Let's say, for example, you're fetching some data, and one of the fields here is something like it's a weather field, right? And that's fetching the current temperature from some other service, and it's just not available, right? It's like something very custom, right? Or you're actually going to run an algorithm and make that data up on the spot and send it, right? It's just some business logic that you can't do. What we do for that is we say, go. We have this thing called actions, right? Where we tell you we say, go and specify just that piece that doesn't exist in your data graph, and just go add that piece, right? So let's say, for example, I want to add that weather piece, right? I can just go in and say, hey, I'm defining a new entity that comes from my business logic, right? And you define that entity and you say, here's my kind of weather entity, right? Whatever. You create that here. And you fetch this not from a GraphQL endpoint or anything. You can just fetch this from a serverless function, right? Or from a microservice, or whatever the owner of that logic is, right? Wherever that data is coming from. What Hasura will do is bring that into your graph, right? And it'll bring that into the rest of your graph, and it'll allow you to add an extra field on top of this artist model, and you can add an extra field which has that weather field, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to break it up into, we take a kind of data driven view of the world, and not a mm, not an endpoint driven view of the world, right? So we're saying there's different pieces of data, and Hasura can own certain pieces of them. And there's certain pieces that Hasura can't own. That's totally fine, right? You own that data, you take care of it. We don't want to interfere with any of that. But as soon as you own that, what we let you do is stitch that into your overall graph, right? So whenever you feel like the model that Hasura is exposing is not ideal and you can't handle it with what you're doing in the database or with what Hasura is doing, skip it. Don't use Hasura for that. Have your own endpoint for just that piece of data, and now you can stitch that whole thing in together, right? We didn't want to get into the business of helping people write logic inside our tool or using our framework, so that we could kind of stick to being a service and not become a framework, right? Because if you become a framework, that becomes kind of a different category of problems to start solving, right? It makes deployment kind of different, right? It makes the the usage experience of it different, right? Like one of the things that we did with 1.0 to 2.0 is that we changed so many internals, but there's just no breaking changes. There's zero breaking changes, right? On a major version update, there's literally zero breaking changes, right? Nothing changes, despite the fact that there's more database sources, authorization system has changed, there's like a whole bunch of things. And that experience is easy for us to provide as a service, right? As soon as that becomes a framework, it becomes complex to kind of guarantee performance, guarantee security, and stuff like that. So we think of that as kind of just delegating to something like a serverless endpoint, where you can just define that piece of the data graph. That's kind of how it fits together.
And that aligns with the spec, right? Of GraphQL, the concept of
exactly
different sources, and you just it's just pulling those sources together. So you're doing the same concept, right? Is
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So if I had two sources of these pieces of data, and let's say I wanted to get the weather data, but I wanted to replace like the location name in the content that I got for the weather data with my location, right? So I kind of want to do like template replacement in the data pieces. Can I do that at this level, or is it? Do I still need to like ship that off to a serverless function or something to do?
No, so those kinds of transformations you can just handle. You can just kind of alias stuff, right? Mix and match pieces that you need to do. All of that you can do via Hasura, as long as it's declarative, basically, right? As long as it's a declarative thing. If it's a procedural thing, then it's something that you should own. But if it's a declarative transformation, you can handle it with Hasura. Like for example, here I have this example where I'm fetching like user data from my database and like Stripe safeguards from Stripe, right? And I don't own the Stripe safeguards, right? That's just an external API that I'm bringing in. That's just the Stripe API that I'm bringing in. And what I've done is I've just like how I create relationships between tables, I've created a relationship between my Stripe like user model and the Stripe API model, right? And I just set up that relationship. It's not a foreign key anymore. It's not like a database thing anymore. It's like from the database to the Stripe thing. And then Hasura kind of handles the database part of it and then just delegates the rest of it to Stripe, for example, right?
So if I had like the Stripe data coming back and it had like a card number, right? Or like the last four of the card, and I actually want to provide my endpoint to be saying like that should return like a masked look of a string. So like 4 stars and then the card number. I could do that transformation here to combine those two pieces of data and say like there's a new property called last 4 mask or something. And then provide. Okay.
Cool. So the number of kind of declarative transformations that we're adding at that is there's kind of like a feature roadmap there. So what you said specifically, for example, we call this like tokenization or masking transformations, right? So that is something that we've just started supporting, where you can kind of mask data, de-identify data, right? Especially again from a enterprise standpoint, becomes really important to say, I want to de-identify things. I don't want name. I want name to come from a dictionary, right? Instead of the raw name, I want like John Doe, Jane Doe, or something like that to come in. Or I want to mask stuff, which is that I want to have like star, 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 space something, right? So those are transformations that Hasura can do. But anything fancier than that, and we'd rather you just write it yourself. Don't even try to muck about trying to figure out how to do it in Hasura. Don't waste your time. Just go ahead and write this piece of code yourself. It's a serverless function. The thing with serverless function is that it's again one of those self-serve logic type things, right? It's literally as close to as what you can get with, say, let me just write 2 lines of JavaScript code and it becomes a thing, right? With no ops. So we're like, that's the best place to write some of this code, right? Just write 2 lines of code, deploy it off. You know it'll work. You know that the cloud vendor will make sure it scales for you, and just bring that into Hasura, right? And then again, the whole kind of piece just kind of comes together.
Awesome. So awesome. I'm super geeked up. Love
this. Yeah. So
I was saying in the chat, I really love it when Justin gets excited. It's one of those episodes. I was like, y'all don't worry about questions. This is Justin and Tanmai are bonding. Just leave him alone.
Right. There's so many things. I just want to talk. Yeah, it's great.
They're nerding out in the chat though too, so it's totally cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're running at the top of the hour, so we're almost done. What other than this magical rest button, which is amazing, what other things are in the 2.0 version of this that we can look out for?
Yeah, so we did so we're doing kind of the multi-database support. We did the REST endpoints. We're doing some of those. We did some of those authorization enhancements, like being able to compose policies automatically together and stuff like that. One of the other things that we're now kind of working on next is stuff around, especially, and this is something that I think will land in our in we're doing a community call for it next I think coming Wednesday. We're adding support for scale out databases. So that means that we're trying to do like a demo where you have Hasura supports subscriptions as well, right? So you can do like a subscription on any entity that's live, right? And you can subscribe to it. And then as that value changes, you just get that value changing. And Hasura makes sure that the subscriptions scale, that they're secure, the right events are being sent to the right people with the right authorization, right? So if I subscribe to this, I'm only getting events about artist ID 10 because I am user 10, right? I'm not getting information about anybody else, no updates or events from anybody else. And so now we're going to demo that with like a single Postgres thing and then scaling that out with something like Citus, which is like a scale out version where you have like a million users with like 10,000 chat threads, right? And subscription is just chugging along, right? Without you worrying about scaling that system at all, right? You go from data modeling, you go from modeling like, here's my thread model, here's my user messages model, here's the security rule. Whoever is a part of the group can read the chat. That's my security model, and you're done, right? And you have an API for all of this that just kind of scales out and works at massive scale as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're kind of demoing over the next few weeks, like very specific features and capabilities. So lots of exciting stuff there.
It's awesome. Very awesome. All right.
Lots of exciting stuff here.
Yeah.
Let me switch off my screen share.
Cool. All right. Yeah, let's do, we'll wrap it up. We'll do some picks. If anybody has any picks, let's maybe go through our panelists first, then I'll ask our guests. Do any of our panelists have picks today?
I always have picks. Alyssa, go ahead.
Doing a recap stream for day 2 on ngconf on the Twitch Code It Live channel. So come hang out, chance to win prizes, and get good highlights from today. So
when is that? Is that right after this? Is that a little bit after this?
It's as soon as Frosty signs off for the day at ngconf. So I've been told that'll be around 5 p.m. Mountain Time. So I try to not overlap him. So just, yeah, as soon ish, 5 p.m. ish.
Ish. Okay, cool. Very cool. Very cool. Bonnie, what you got?
So I have 2 things. They're both Angular Nation related. We have, as you know, the community hangout right after this. Hasura, I think, Tanmai, I think, said you got a call. You have to jump on a call, and then he's going to try and come and join us if he has time. So if you guys want to ask Tanmai questions, if he has time after his call, he's going to come and join us, and maybe he can do a little more screen share. I know I saw a couple people in this chat tonight that have never seen Hasura before tonight, so that'll be cool.
Sweet.
And my other pick is, go ahead, Tanmai.
No. I said hopefully we'll be able to join 30 minutes there, so should be fun.
That would be great. And my other pick is, I want to let you guys know that we just launched an Angular mentor matching program on Angular Nation. So you can get a mentor or you can be a mentor. You can actually be a mentor and have a mentor at the same time if you want to. And it's free. But registration is only open until next Friday. So if you're interested, we're going to probably do it again. But for right now, this is our pilot program. So if you want to participate in the pilot program, go sign up before next week.
That's on Angular Nation?
On Angular Nation, yes. And it's free.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. I have a pick. I might have picked this before in a show, but whatever. I've got these coasters that are rubber floppy disk. I know this is going back, so maybe not everybody knows about this, but it's they're floppy disk. Don't stick these in your computer, even if you have a drive. I don't know if you have a drive or not, but they're just coasters for stuff. They're this floppy disk coaster, and I've actually got different colors of them. So there's like red and pink, and you can actually write on them. So like back in the day, how we'd write what files are on here, you could do that. I haven't written anything on here yet, but I will.
Wait, those are actual floppy disks, right?
No, they're rubber.
No, it's a coaster.
Oh, they're rubber.
So it's a coaster. It's rubber, which is even cooler because the rubber makes it real easy. Like, I don't know if you've had coasters. I've had coasters that are like solid and you put a wet glass that sweats and then you grab it and like the coaster sticks to it or slides off and scares the crap out of you because it lands on your desk. Yeah. So rubber just doesn't, it's great. It doesn't slide on the desk. Yeah, it's awesome. So anyways, that's my pick. So cool. Tanmai, do you have any picks you want to share or anything?
Nothing in particular, just that I'm looking forward to all of the GraphQL subscriptions and some of the scale out database stuff that we're doing next week. So around, do feel free to join in.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for coming on, sharing your time. Thanks for everything that you've done with this Hasura and on all that stuff. But really thank you for coming on and helping educate us and showing us this stuff and sharing your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure as ever.
Come back soon.
Yes, please do. All right, that's a wrap. Have a good one, everyone. See you next time. Later.